Robert E. Lee is well known as a Confederate military general, but perhaps his greatest contribution to the United States was his effort to reunite the country following the American Civil War. In the opinions of his contemporaries and historians, Lee played a crucial role in restoring peace following the war, and in today's video, we delve into how Robert E. Lee helped save the Union. The American Civil War was the most catastrophic event in American history. Over the course of 4 years, more than 620,000 veterans, both U.S. and Confederate, lost their lives. At the time, this was more than 2% of the entire population of America. In the Confederate States, 30% of the military-aged white men died, and while the trauma affected nearly every home across the nation, its effects were felt most deeply in the South. In addition to the human carnage, the war disrupted nearly all forms of life for Southerners. As the Union Army marched south, soldiers set fire to homes, towns, and cities, trampled farms, severed railroads, killed livestock, and at times committed unspeakable acts of savagery upon the wives, children, and families that Southern soldiers had left behind when they marched off to war. The end of the war upended every aspect of life in the South at the end of 1865. With the abolition of slavery in the Southern states, nearly 4 million African Americans across the South were freed, leading to almost instantaneous housing, employment, and education crisis for these newly freed Americans, and creating an enormous burden on Southern communities across the land. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse in Central Virginia, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia after 4 years of fighting. While surrender seemed inevitable to Lee, at least one of his generals suggested he not surrender and instead have the army take to the woods and bushes and carry on the fight. Similarly, former Virginia Governor Henry Wise encouraged Lee to fight, saying, "Country be damned, there is no country. You are the country to these men." Lee, however, declined to take their advice. He decided instead that refusing to surrender would bring on a state of affairs that it would take the country years to recover from. Realizing that further fighting would have no impact on the outcome of the struggle, Lee made the momentous decision to stop the further effusion of blood and surrender his army, even though he had famously stated he would rather die 1,000 deaths. Lee's victories as a Confederate general showcased brilliant maneuvers, but it was his grace and humility in defeat that set the tone for reuniting the country. With this one decision, Lee had spared the country from the divisive guerrilla warfare that surely would have followed as the Southern Army began to break apart under the immense pressures exerted by the massive Union Army. Lee, as well as many Confederate officers and soldiers, feared for their treatment as possible prisoners of war. In many rebellions around the world, victors often humiliated or denigrated defeated leaders before executing them. When Lee dressed in his finest uniform on the morning of the surrender, he indicated to his staff that he expected to be taken prisoner and wanted to be in proper form and make his best appearance. At Appomattox, however, General Ulysses S. Grant, respecting Lee greatly, gave him all of the surrender terms that he requested, allowing them to be paroled and sent home, retaining all of their own horses, mounts, and sidearms if they promised not to take up arms against the United States again. Lee and Grant also agreed to appoint 3 officers from each army to act as commissioner for the surrender, who would work out the details of issuing parole passes, returning Union prisoners the Confederates had captured along the retreat, and sending rations from Union lines to Confederates. Over the next few weeks, additional Confederate forces surrendered using Lee's surrender terms as a template. These generous terms were in the spirit of reuniting the country and lessening the blow to not only a broken Southern economy, but also the broken spirit of those Southerners who had sacrificed so much for their homes, their families and communities, only to have them devastated by the reality of the end of the war. Lee left Appomattox for Richmond following the surrender. With the United States Army having seized and occupied Lee's family home, Arlington House, and turned it into a military cemetery, Lee and his family tried to chart a path forward, taking up temporary residence at a home in Richmond, encouraging fellow Confederates to go home, all you boys who fought with me and helped build up the shattered fortunes of our old state. Lee desired that white Southerners move past the Confederacy and move forward towards peace and reconciliation, fearing that the passions and feelings of people in both the North and South could drive the sections into more conflict and bloodshed. He counseled his fellow Southerners that it should be the object of all to avoid controversy, to allay passion, to give full scope to reason and every kindly feeling. By doing this and encouraging our citizens to engage in the duties of life with all their heart and mind, with a determination not to be turned aside by thoughts of the past and fears of the future, our country will not only be restored in material prosperity, but will be advanced in science, virtue, and religion. Some former Confederates, however, still felt humiliated and persecuted, calling for continued hostilities with the United States. Lee, however, consoled them and told them it was their duty as Southerners to return home and to rebuild their communities. Colonel J. Stoddard Johnston said after talking to Lee that, as great as I had held him as a military chieftain, my admiration of him in this trying hour was even grander than when I had seen him at the head of invincible legions. Lee had desired to live a private life after the war, but he knew that because of his status and fame, his actions and words would influence the public opinion. With that in mind, in the late summer of 1865, Lee accepted the position of president of Washington College, today Washington and Lee University, in Lexington, Virginia. At this time, he was still uncertain of his fate and whether the federal government would prosecute him for treason, as some in the North were calling for. He was at first reluctant to accept the position for fear that it might embroil the struggling college in controversy. Ultimately, he accepted and moved to Lexington, Virginia. In this new position, Lee decided to commit his remaining years to the education and betterment of the young men of Virginia. Lee wrote in September of 1865 that the issues between the North and South had been decided, and he believed it to be the duty of everyone to unite in the restoration of the country and the re-establishment of peace and harmony. Further demonstrating his commitment to reunification, Lee asked President Andrew Johnson for a pardon in the summer of 1865, taking the amnesty oath on October 2nd, and thus once again swearing allegiance to the United States government. His most famous biographer, Douglas Southall Freeman, wrote how Lee's personal example of requesting a pardon from President Johnson was an action that helped lead fellow former Confederates to submit to federal authority. News that General Lee had asked for a pardon soon became known. It had much the effect with the South that Grant and Halleck had predicted. Many of those who had fought with General Lee reasoned that they could safely follow his leadership in this particular and could accept the president's amnesty. Historians thought the amnesty oath that Lee submitted in October 1865 was lost. However, the oath paperwork was rediscovered in the National Archives in 1970. Lee never officially regained his American citizenship during his life. In 1975, the United States Congress voted to restore Robert E. Lee's citizenship, as this entire nation has long recognized the outstanding virtues of courage, patriotism, and selfless devotion to duty of General R.E. Lee, and has recognized the contribution of General Lee in healing the wounds of the war between the states. President Gerald R. Ford officially posthumously restored Robert E. Lee's citizenship at a ceremony on the portico at Arlington House. In 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant invited Lee to the White House. Despite the fact that Grant and Lee fought bitterly during the war, they conversed during a private meeting in the White House, cementing the impression in Southern hearts and minds that they were in fact rejoined with the Union in all things. On October 12, 1870, Robert E. Lee died with people in both northern and southern states mourning his death. Over the next century, Lee would become revered for his work towards reconciliation after the war. Numerous United States presidents, including Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy, heaped praise on Lee's character. The veneration of Robert E. Lee ultimately led to the erection of numerous monuments and memorials to his actions across the South and the publishing of numerous memoirs and stories of Lee, with his impeccable character earning him the nickname of the Marble Man. Lee was so revered across the entire nation that in 1925 the United States Congress ordered his home, Arlington House, be restored to honor him largely for his work to reunite the nation after the war. Shortly after Arlington was set to be restored, the Arlington Memorial Bridge was built over the Potomac River, connecting Arlington House to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, symbolically linked the North and South as a further gesture of reunion. Then, in 1955, Arlington House was made a permanent memorial to Robert E. Lee because he attained world renown as a military genius, fervently devoting himself to peace. Most historians agree that Lee's efforts to promote peace following the American Civil War were essential in the reunification of the nation. Douglas Southall Freeman wrote that the Confederates came to consider it as much the course of patriotism to emulate General Lee in peace as it had been to follow him in war. More than any other American, General Lee kept the tragedy of the war from being a continuing national calamity. Even Lee's more critical biographers came to this same conclusion. Elizabeth Brown Pryor noted that Lee came closest to greatness in the enlightened decisions he took to foster peace and rebuild the South in the early aftermath of the war. This was his grand visionary moment. The dignified relinquishment of command is among the most ennobling of American traditions, and Robert E. Lee's actions just after the Civil War are a proud example of that tradition. A salve for a devastated citizenry, a running start towards reconciliation, and the key to reuniting the Southern states with the Union.
If you enjoyed today's video and would like to see more content like this, be sure to take a shot at the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest BirdDogg content. And if you'd like to support the channel, for a limited time there's exclusive Civil War Diaries merchandise available in the video link below.